Welcome. Let's get straight to it. The document set for this briefing is dated February 2nd, 2026, and the environment it describes, well, it's defined by one core dynamic, a convergence of frictions. Everything really starts with this number, 17.2 lakh crore. This is the record-breaking gross market borrowing planned for fiscal year 27. You can think of it as the fuel for the nation's entire investment engine. But this very fuel is creating the central tension of this moment. See, to fund a massive 12.2 trillion rupee capex plan, the government has to tap the markets on a scale we've never seen before. And as you can see, the market, well, it's pushing back. The source documents don't mince words. A quote from the executive summary says it all. The reality is funding friction. This isn't just some side effect, it's a direct collision between fiscal ambition and the market's capacity to absorb it. And that brings us to the golden thread for today's briefing, friction. We're seeing deliberate, consequential friction being introduced across multiple domains. We're talking finance, regulation, and even national security. The takeaway here is crystal clear. The operating environment is becoming less smooth, and that's happening both by design and as a consequence. Bottom line, progress now requires navigating resistance.
So here's our plan. We'll start with a deep dive into 3 top impact stories. Then we'll look at 4 systemic shifts happening just under the surface. After that, we'll check what's on the radar and wrap up with a synthesis of what this all means for your mandate as leaders.
Now we turn to our deep dive. We're going to analyze the 3 events that are having the biggest and most immediate impact on the current environment.
First up, the funding constraint. The event, of course, is that record borrowing. But what are the stakes? Well, we're seeing a rising cost of capital across the board, with the 10-year bond yield hardening to 6.7% and a really tight liquidity environment as the rupee slides toward 92 to the dollar. So, what should you watch? All eyes are on the Reserve Bank's Monetary Policy Committee meeting from February 4th to 6th, and any open market operations that might come up to manage this tension.
This brings us to a useful way of thinking about this, the anchor and the twist. The anchor, our baseline assumption, is that a national budget is a plan for growth. But the twist is that its funding mechanism has now become a primary constraint on the market itself. Now, our second story really illustrates a totally different kind of friction, deliberate policy. The government is taking action based on some pretty startling data from a SEBI survey. Get this, it found that 91% of retail investors in the futures and options market lose money.
You can see the government's logic laid out in 4 clear steps. 1, the diagnosis, widespread retail losses. 2, the objective, curb speculation. 3, the lever they're pulling, a major hike in the securities transaction tax. And 4, the consequence, a sharp market repricing and a direct hit to the revenue models of any intermediaries that were built on high trading volumes.
And here's the anchor and twist for this story. The anchor belief is that taxes are for raising revenue. Right? But the twist? This tax is explicitly designed to generate friction and change behavior. The whole intent of the policy has shifted.
Okay, our third deep dive takes us into the security domain, where the lines are starting to blur in a really dangerous way. We're seeing a convergence of organized crime and geopolitical conflict.
The trigger here is a public claim made by the Lawrence Bishnoi crime syndicate. They're alleging this incredibly complex international operation. A team deployed from Mexico, an operation in Portugal, targeting a person with claimed ties to Pakistan's ISI. Now, while Portuguese authorities haven't verified this yet, just the claimed global path itself, from Mexico to Europe to South Asia, creates enormous geopolitical friction. This reveals another critical anchor and twist. The anchor, organized crime is a domestic law enforcement problem. The twist, it's now emerging as a potential vector for these transnational shadow conflicts. Bottom line, 3 totally distinct frictions, in funding, in regulation, and in security, are defining the immediate landscape.
Now we turn to systemic shifts. Beyond the headlines, these are the slower-moving, structural changes that are reshaping the entire environment.
I'll walk you through 4 of them. First, compliance. A new income tax act is coming into effect, which means tighter enforcement is now just a permanent cost of doing business. Second, diplomacy. Pakistan's threat to boycott cricket shows how geopolitics can create direct commercial risk in brand new arenas, like sports. Third, environment.
Budget cuts for pollution control mean that operational risk from bad air in North India stays high, even as the policy response gets weaker. And finally, technology. Mission mode funding for sectors like semiconductors is shifting the advantage to firms that align with state goals.
And to illustrate that environmental friction, the data is pretty stark. Funding for pollution control sees a clear cut, going from a revised estimate of 1,300 crores in FY26 down to 1,091 crores for FY27.
And here's what really highlights the disconnect. The source documents point out this budget cut is happening during an unfolding public health crisis in that exact region. Bottom line, these undercurrents in compliance, diplomacy, environment, technology are creating new, systemic frictions that will absolutely shape the strategic environment for the long term.
Now we turn to on the radar. These are early signals where the strategic intent seems clear, but the operational details are still missing.
We're tracking two key signals here. First, a new foreign assets disclosure scheme has been announced, but critical details like the start date just aren't there yet. The thing to watch for is the official circular. Second, in the corporate bond market, reform proposals are public, but the detailed guidelines are still pending. Bottom line, these signals represent potential future shifts, but their real-world impact depends entirely on those forthcoming regulatory specifics.
Now we turn to the final synthesis. Let's tie all of this together.
We began this briefing with the theme of friction, and we've now seen how it's showing up as a funding constraint, as a regulatory tool, and as a security threat. It is the single defining characteristic of this operating environment.
So the convergence of these frictions demands that you reassess your core assumptions. In the fiscal domain with record public borrowing, you have to reassess your cost of capital. In the market, that new behavioral tax means you have to reassess any revenue models dependent on high retail churn. And in security, these transnational claims mean you must reassess your duty of care protocols and your exposure to geopolitical risk.
And this brings us to the final question for you and for your teams. As this systemic friction continues to rise, have you stress-tested your organization's most critical assumptions about funding, about markets, and about security? Bottom line, the mandate for leadership is to navigate an environment where progress is no longer smooth and to build resilience against these compounding frictions.